So thanks everyone for coming here today. I'm sorry we're a couple of minutes late starting. Though I know there was, can everyone hear me on this? Yeah. Is that better? Yeah. Okay. I'll really try and pretend I'm at karaoke or something, which I feel the passion. But so thanks everyone for coming today. It's great to see such a great turnout. And I know we're starting a few minutes late, but we did want to just talk to the candidates before they had a run off at the end. So we will try and keep the time. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Saoirse Brady. I'm the Executive Director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust. And for those of you who don't know the IPRT, well, you might be in the wrong room, but I think you do all know us. But we are Ireland's leading non-governmental organisation working for systemic penal reform. And our vision is a just, humane Ireland where prison is used as a last resort. And so I'm sure you're all very familiar with our work. So we are delighted to be here today with candidates from 5 different parties, and I'm going to introduce them all one by one, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the format, and then give you a bit of an overview of what IPRT's asks are, just to remind the panel we did give them homework to do before they came, but just it'll be a little bit of revision for them, and then we'll get stuck into the questions. So I suppose first up we have Patrick Costello from the Green Party, who's a candidate in Dublin South Central and has come home. He used to live here, I believe, as a leading heiress, I think it was, yeah. We also have Angus O'Snoddick from Sinn Féin, who is a candidate in Dublin South Central as well. In fact, we didn't ask any other candidates from the constituency, or could have gotten really awkward. And next we have Sinead Gibney, who is from the Social Democrats and running in Dublin Macdonald. We have Éireann O'Riordan from Labour, who's the current MEP for Dublin and has stood in for his other Labour colleagues. I'm delighted to have him here today. And then Jim O'Callaghan from Fianna Fáil, who's the candidate in Dublin West South. So we also have apologies, just to say, from Fine Gael, and both Barry Ward and Alan Farrell couldn't make it today. Also Luke Silk from Aint, who was actually meant to be here, but he's based in Galway East. And unfortunately, with the weather today and the weather warnings, he had to tell us this morning that he couldn't make it either. But we did invite a representative from anyone who was elected to the Dáil, or political party that was elected to the 33rd Dáil. So just to say that. So we really welcome the fact that all of the parties here today have engaged with us pre-election, before it was called, as well as when it's been called. And I suppose just so you get a sense of the format of the day, and what we have given the speakers at briefings, we've given them some draft questions that we're probably going to ask, and if there's time we might ask a couple more. But we do hope to get to questions from the audience as well at the very end. So hopefully we will cover a lot of the subjects that you might have questions on, but if you do have any at the end, we'll hopefully get to you, but again, it depends on time. Each member will have a max of 2 minutes to respond to each question, and they'll present their party's positions and their vision for the future as it relates to the topic. We have Aisling in the front row here. She is going to keep you to time, and she'll hold up a yellow sheet when it is 30 seconds to go, and a red sheet is a hard stop, and I will intervene and interrupt at that point. But hopefully you don't have to. You're all pros at this stage. And so we hope to spend about an hour and 15 minutes on that, and then hopefully have 20 minutes to 30 minutes for questions from the audience. And so I just wanted to, before we get started, maybe just talk to you about IPRT's asks for the election, as well as some of the work that we have done in terms of public attitudes polling. So before, or when the election was called, or just before it actually, we issued our 10 priority asks for general election manifestos, and I'm glad to see some of the manifestos have reflected them, some more than others. And we are doing an analysis of each of the political parties' manifestos, which is available on our website as well. For those who we've only seen in the last day, we don't have those up yet, but we will have them up shortly. But I suppose we had 10 priority asks. You should all have them in front of you there. But just to maybe pick out a few of them, I mentioned that IPRT's raison d'etre is that prison should be a last resort. So obviously we want the parties to commit to that in the next programme for government, and that's at both sentencing and pre-trial detention stage. We want them to implement penal policy that's based on coherent data and the evidence base. And we have done everything we can to try and bring that forward, both in the discussions around the manifestos and with the meetings that we've had with each of the political parties in advance of this. And, we have also talked about transparency and decision making, and I imagine that might come up in some of the discussion today. And then one of our other key asks is ratifying the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture. So at the moment, Ireland is the only EU member state that hasn't yet ratified OPCAT, even though we signed it 17 years ago. It's been in a number of programmes for governments. We need to see the next government, whoever that might be, deliver on that particular priority and get that moving. So back in 2007, IPRT would have commissioned public attitudes polling, and we asked a number of questions. And we were still using that polling up until fairly recently, so we wanted to take a temperature and see what the public appetite was for change. And as you can see here, and it should be on the page that you have in front of you as well, we asked people how important it was for the next Irish government to prioritise alternatives to prison in the next programme for government. And so we commissioned Red C, which is the polling company that I think all NGOs seem to be using at the moment, and they would have polled 1,006 adults of voting age right across the political spectrum. And as you can see, 4 out of 5 people said that it should be a priority. So we have that. We know that people think that there should be alternatives to prison for people who commit non-violent offences. So I just want to reiterate that again to the colleagues here today. And if you take out the don't knows, it's actually 86%. And you can see there, apologies to the smaller parties. Red C only gives the breakdown of the 3 bigger parties and some of the independents. But you can see it's a fairly even spread there. So I think that shows the public's appetite for change. We also asked them, and we would have done this in 2007, and similar results this time around, if you were given €10 million to tackle crime, what would you spend it on? What would actually tackle crime? We gave them a list of 7 options because that's what we had this time around. We updated it to tell them what they would get for their money. So, 350 guards, for example. I'm not going to go through them all. You can see them there. The number 1 option was more Gardaí. The number 2 option, interestingly enough, was drug treatment cases with continuing care. So we looked at how much that would cost, and it looked like we didn't think it was actually worthwhile saying, a drug treatment case. We looked at continuing care for 2 years as well. Youth workers was number 3. So you can see there that 1 in 3 people actually chose person-centred or non-justice interventions to help tackle crime. So that is really important, we think. More prison spaces, which I know has appeared in a number of manifestos, was number 5 on the list. And only 7% of people thought that was actually the right option. So then as well, we asked about, and we would have asked this back in 2007, we did have to update the language a little bit, I have to say, but we did ask, we know that our prisons, we have record number of people in prison at the moment, 5,000 people and counting, and we know the majority of them have mental health and or addiction issues. So we asked about it, and the majority of people thought that people who had a mental health and or an addiction issue should not go to prison, but instead should receive treatment in an appropriate health facility. Now, whether or not those are available, that's another discussion, but that's what they said. So I think that's really important to note as well. And then when we asked about increasing prison capacity and, increasing prison spaces, and again, this was for people who committed less serious offences and non-violent crimes. You can see there, 2/3 of people thought that prison was not the magic bullet. That, and there was so much in this polling, that they talk about, 1 in 2 people think that people come out of prison worse than they go in. But you're not here to listen to me speak today, so I'll leave it there. But the polling is available on our website. I'd encourage you all to look at it, use it in your work, use it in your conversations with politicians. We have questions for candidates as well, so we will do a follow-up email after this and send all that out to you. So I suppose now we're going to get to the meat of it, and we're going to start with, what we're all here to hear. So the candidates have been given questions in advance, so hopefully they've had a chance to look at those, and they'll know what what the party position is on it. So I mentioned overcrowding there, and I'm going to go, I will change it up every time we ask a question so everyone gets a fair bite of it. But Patrick, I might start with you on this one. So addressing overcrowding. I mentioned there, like, we have over 5,000 people in prison. Today we have 5,100 people in prison. 1 in 5 of those are in pre-trial detention, on remand. And, we keep setting records for prison overcrowding. We have a maximum capacity of 4,519 spaces in prison at the moment. We know there's nearly 300 people sleeping on a mattress on the floor beside a toilet in a prison cell. So, and 4 in 5 people committed to Irish prisons and were under sentence in 2023 were for periods of less than 12 months. So, Patrick, what would your party's vision be for tackling prison overcrowding, and what role, if any, do alternatives to custody claims?
Thanks very much, and thanks for having us here today.
Is that on? Can everyone hear?
Can everyone hear me? I can just shout it out. No, I think so. And so look, it's not that big a room, I'll just shout it out. Yeah, look, thanks very much for having us today. I think it's a really important topic to discuss. And I think, look, I'll start with the very fact that we have in our agenda, in the Green manifesto in the Green Party, a commitment to reduce overcrowding by greater use of non-custodial sanctions, greater use of community sanctions, and using greater use of models of restorative justice. And I think, you guys have done great research in showing the rising number of short sentences, how useless they are in preventing crime, and how the data says we need to use all these things. So using non-custodial sentences, community sentences, these are good policy anyway, as well as having the effect of reducing overcrowding. I think also then, like it's important to talk about, you talked there about the number 2 option for people was about drug treatment and continuing care. And I think if we look at the drive that is coming from the Citizen Assembly, from the Justice Committee, from the Special Committee on Drugs, to move to a health-based approach to drug addiction, that will really reduce, and the decriminalisation will really reduce it. But I think also we have to get serious about rehabilitation options in prison. I see Lynn here, who was the main driver, I can't take any credit, for the report from the Justice Committee around rehabilitation options in prison and how there just aren't enough of them. And if we want people to not go back to prison, we need to provide them serious rehabilitation options. And I think if we do that, we can that will contribute to reducing overcrowding as well.
Great. Thanks for keeping the time there. Angus, I'll ask you the same question.
Well, this is one of the issues that is carried on for many other generations at this stage. And all we've seemed to have as a society is that the argument thus far is, we need more prison space. And we don't need more prison space. We need the prison space that we have to be fit for purpose in the first place. We should never have a situation where you're overcrowded, where you have people sleep on the floor, whether it's asylum seekers or whether it's prisoners. We need a humane approach. We also need to make sure that those who shouldn't be in prison aren't in prison. And there's a lot more people in prison now that shouldn't be, and could be dealt with very, very easily and better kind of in the community, directed and supported by various organisations, and a lot cheaper for the state than what's happening at the moment. Those who are convicted of non-violent crimes, they're ideal. Kind of, if you're willing to tackle it and you're willing to invest the money in tackling the underlying crisis or causes that have them in prison in the first place. That's what doesn't happen in many cases. And so I'm fully behind every single action that can be taken, whether that's restorative justice, whether it's community sanctions, or whether kind of we look at any other method and look at the international best practice. We're a small nation, and we owe it to our citizens not to be locking them up if there is no need to lock them up.
Great, thanks, and so far so good at the timing. So, Sinead,
I'll do my best. Thanks, Saoirse, and thank you so much to the IPRT for this event. I think it's such an important topic to keep front and centre in the middle of an election, whereas it is all too easily forgotten. I'm Sinead Gibney, as you've heard, and I'm the Social Democrat candidate for Dublin Down. My previous role was Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. So I'm in an interesting position at the moment where a lot of my work over the last number of years has been with those groups in society who are most marginalised and disadvantaged, towards now speaking to electorate who have a very different set of views and trying to reconcile the two, because I believe in government that we need to show political leadership which really speaks for those who are least heard in society. And people who are in prison and their families are exactly that. Our goal in government is to create a progressive penal reform system which prioritises reducing recidivism, takes into account the needs of victims, and ultimately that works for all of society. Poverty and inequality are the key underlying causes of crime, and yet at present the majority of funding goes towards dealing with the consequences of crime as opposed to dealing with those underlying causes. If we can divert instead that funding towards youth services, mental health, addiction, all of those areas, we're going to not only deal with it at source, but also do what is right by those communities who find themselves hugely overrepresented in the criminal justice system and in prison generally. We are very much aligned with the research that's being shared today and the key manifesto points that the IPRT are putting forward in absolutely pursuing as default non-custodial sentences for minor non-violent offences, but also to look at those alternatives, to look at innovations in how we can change penal policy in Ireland, and also look towards the future. Imprisonment was introduced before we had things like the internet, and we need to think about and rethink as a society what we consider to be the taking away the right to freedom and what it actually means in today's more connected society. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Dáil, what do you know?
Yeah, thanks very much. And sorry for Sinead the way we just heard all my jokes right through the European campaign. She knows everything I'm probably going to say next.
Still mention crayon.
Crayon, and I look again Ryan. But anyway, look, it's an incredibly important topic. Dáil Eireann is my name. I'm not a candidate in the general election, but I am an MEP for Dublin. I've done a lot of work with Lynn over the last number of years in trying to reimagine our criminal justice system. We've been into Mountjoy, we've played football in Mountjoy, and we listened to what the governor had to say there. And his big argument to us was that 4-month sentences were completely missed. So what's the answer to prison overcrowding? Is it more prison spaces or is it less prisoners? And I'm flatly on the side of less prisoners. There's too many people in prison who don't need to be there. You mentioned mental health issues, you mentioned addiction issues. And I absolutely agree with what Patrick has said about drugs and policy, and a number of political parties have actually moved and switched their stance on decriminalisation for drug users, which is very, very welcome in this election. And the Labour Party is absolutely for the decriminalisation of the drug user. We need to understand much more profoundly why people end up in prison. Social reasons, poverty reasons, the inequality reasons. I used to be a teacher and a principal in a disadvantaged school, and more often than not, when there was a row in a classroom and it brought down to the principal's office, it wasn't about the row. It was more or less normally because neither of them had breakfast. So if you have sort of an outbreak of violence or an outbreak of an outing of that energy, normally there's an underlying reason for it, and we need to address the underlying reason for it. Of the things that I would absolutely invest in, if beyond prison spaces or the criminal justice system, Dash Plus is a proposal from a number of disadvantaged principals, about 100 primary schools in particular, who are looking for multi-agency support, trauma-based support that will cost probably less than the mobile phone packages that are going to be given out to schools next year. That's the type of intervention that we need at a very basic level. We need to understand poverty and disadvantage and inequality more than building more things.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I just want to thank the Penal Reform Trust for organising this event, and I want to thank them for inviting me and Jim O'Callaghan and Canton for Fianna Fáil in Dublin Place South. I suppose the start is, as Saoirse has indicated, we do have overcrowding. We have quite significant overcrowding at present, with I think it's around 5,100 inmates in prison. That's about 113% of our capacity. And listen, I'm happy to engage with issues in terms of how we reduce the numbers of people in prison. But at present, we have a shortage of prison places. That's why in the Fianna Fáil manifesto we said that the budget commitment that was announced in budget 2025 for the funding of 1,100 new prison places, that's in our manifesto. And when you look at our population and the increase of the population, which is now probably in the region of 5.3 million, I don't think it's unreasonable that there should be increase in terms of prison spaces available. It's inevitably going to be the case that in terms of people who are in prison, it's going to increase as your population increases. Listen, I fully appreciate that the causes of people ending up in prison are very complex. I also think prisons should be places for people who have committed violent offences. I think we should look at completely different mechanisms of punishing or responding to persons who are guilty of different criminal offences. And I think as an Oireachtas, we need to look at that more. I've said frequently in debates in the Oireachtas, but when we draft legislation that makes something a criminal offence, generally there's the standard provision that's put in the end in terms of offences and penalties. And we hand over all responsibility really to the judiciary to say, listen, the sentence for this shall be a prison sentence not exceeding 5 years, or maximum sentence of 5 years, or a fine not exceeding X what it is. If we want to try to play a greater role and recognise the complexity of sentencing, if we want to stop people going to prison, as policymakers and politicians, we need to play the role in respect of that. Because as you know, drugs is a huge part in terms of people going to prisons. I think we'll have an opportunity to talk about that later, just in the red card.
Thanks, Jim. Actually, the next question is around sentencing, but you did mention something there about additional prison spaces and those being necessary. So we might come back to it later, but maybe just for the candidates to think about what if you had to build more prison spaces, what are you talking about there? What are you thinking? Are you talking about open prison spaces? Because there have been many recommendations over the years around that. So we might come back to that later. But obviously we'll ask all of the candidates as well, maybe, because I know it has come up in some of the manifestos as well, about different types of spaces for people. But the next question is on sentencing, and I suppose we are all very aware that that there can be inconsistency, or what appears to be inconsistency, in decision-making, in judicial decision-making, in sentencing. And we have to respect judicial independence. But one of the things that has been promised for a long time are sentencing guidelines. There has been a sentencing guidelines information committee set up, and they have started, they're about to start producing actual guidelines. They have produced other documents and been engaged in research to date as well. But I suppose I might start with Sinead for this one. What is your party's approach to ensuring fairness, transparency, and proportionality in sentencing?
Well, I think we need to really look at the suitability of the current prison model, and I think we have to do that with a view to improving rehabilitation and lowering recidivism. And sentencing has to be looked at within that framework, as far as I'm concerned. And as a party, we support greater use of community service, monitored with probation, rather than frequent warnings and suspended sentences and so on. And I think mental health really comes into play here, where, as we've heard, the general public are with us on this, that people shouldn't be going to prison if they are people who need mental health treatment. And also then furthermore acknowledging that when prison does have to happen, so when we do have to, as a last resort, send people to prison, that is done keeping in mind what the mental health effect is for people when they get there. And I think, again, in this election, it's really important to remember, I had a really wonderful exchange with a lovely woman the other day up in Stepaside, who said to me, when we put more police on the streets, we're losing. And it's so rare in Rathdown to get that kind of take on things, and so refreshing. She was an older woman, and she just said, we have just lost sight of the inequality in this society is just worse and worse every year. And we are leaving behind communities. And if our only response, and that is the response of centrist parties, it is put more police on the streets, put more people in prison, speaking to what they think their voter base likes, whereas what we can see from the IPRT findings here today is that that's not where society is. We all recognise and acknowledge that it should be not your immediate outcome in life. If you're born into a certain neighbourhood or into a certain part of the world, that you're going to most likely end up in prison. That's not where we should be at, and we have to address that as a cause.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sinead. I might go to Jim on that one next.
Yeah, I just start to create an air of a conflict here, but I think you're incorrect, Sinead, when you say that people don't want more Gardaí in the street. If you look at the research that's been carried out by the IPRT, though 41% of people, if they had extra 10 million, have said they would like to see additional Gardaí. So it's not incompatible. The reason people want to see more Gardaí in the streets is because it gives them a sense of security, a sense of safety, and I don't think it's like in other countries where we have a police force that's viewed as being aggressive in terms of its policing on the streets. They're very much perceived as being, I think, community officers. In terms of sentencing is extremely complex, and I think as policymakers we probably don't give sufficient attention to it. No case is going to be the same in respect of sentencing. But I do think that as policymakers, we need to give consideration to other mechanisms where we can have a greater say in respect of what the sentence should be. Also, it's very difficult for the public to find information about sentencing. We're dependent upon journalists being in court that report it in order to see what type of sentences people get. We should, in my opinion, have some form of a database where people can find out the sentences that have been given out. You might find out what's happening in the CCJ, but you won't find out what's happening in the circuit court down in Tipperary unless there are reporters there. So we need more information in respect of it. Fianna Fáil, in terms of the issue you mentioned, Saoirse, Fianna Fáil has mentioned that we're going to give consideration to an open prison for women. That's something I think that could sort of change the manner by which sentences are effected. But ultimately, if somebody commits a violent offence, or somebody has committed serious sexual offence or rape, there has to be, I would have thought, custodial sentence in respect to that. So we need to assess where is that going to be spent, and we need to understand what's going to be the evaluation in terms of whether there should be consistency and how much consistency.
Look, I mentioned the trip we made to Mountjoy. I've visited quite a few times over the last number of years, mostly at the Milan's initiation. I think one of the sentences was along with the governor. He said, if you take one thing back, please do something about 4 month sentences. They don't work. They're not helping anybody. They're burning up the system. You don't achieve anything when you're here for 4 months. You can't get involved in any education program. It's a waste of time. Yeah. And I would feel, I don't have any law background myself. I don't have any legal person in my family. But if you do spend time in the court system, it does feel like a parallel universe. And people always say politicians are out of touch. But I have to say, if I ever step into a courtroom, not because I'm accused of anything, because I'm observed or something, it does feel like a parallel universe. It does feel like a disconnected organized state. And I think, I don't know how we can do this in an appropriate manner, but something has to happen where we stop this cycle of 4 month sentences, which are not given out for serious violent crime or rape or sexual assault. They're given out for other reasons. And they're not happening. I want one more point, which you mentioned women there. We have to talk about the disproportionate damage that prison does, particularly to women. Yes. And their families and the distrust they then have with the state, and how they have a fear about their children and what's going to happen to their children. There's a lot of intergenerational mistrust with the state, and putting people, incarcerating people, it only compounds that and makes it worse for the next one.
Thanks, Aaron. Amos?
Yeah, I don't think anybody's suggesting that we do away with prison. But there is a need for some people to be sentenced and put in jail for long periods. Aaron's quite correct in relation to smaller and shorter sentences. The vast majority of those can be dealt with in the community, haven't been dealt with in the community. And if you look at most of them, and there are underlying issues, whether it's poverty, whether it's addiction or mental health, prison is not the right place for that. And that more and more, I think the judges need to be aware of that and have, not necessarily the luxury, but have the ability to sentence those appropriately to services. So the question there was the 10 million. Additional guarding, no problem with additional guarding, but that's not the solution. The solution is additional guarding and additional residential places for people who are in addiction, additional people who can help deal with mental trauma that a lot of our sentenced prisoners and their families are going through. Additional money to address the housing situation that those who are in prison or coming out of prison are focused. There's a whole range of things. So yes, we do need a different approach. We need the sentencing guidelines to be working. It hasn't worked. It needs to be activated properly and evidence-based, of course. But we need those who haven't committed non-violent offences to be serving whatever sentence is due and in the community, not just solely definitely community orders. And then the public can see justice being done if that's what they wish, but also there is a possibility of people benefiting, if you want, from the services, from the approach, rather than not benefiting.
Yeah, thanks, Angus. And Patrick?
Yeah, and so as you say there, we're supposed to have sentencing guidelines, and there is supposed to be a database of sentencing. At the minute, the court service don't have enough staff for their modernisation programme, and that impacts in lots of different ways of our justice system functions. One of them is exactly the issue of the sentencing guidelines, the database. In response to a parliamentary question, the court service told me they needed 160 staff. At the time, they had 120. That's been up to 150, but a lot of that's going to be eaten up by extra judges and around them. I don't think that 160 is enough if you want to deliver the modernisation of the court service and the ability to have the database, the sentencing guidelines, and have them quickly. Because how long have they been in training? Years, and they still haven't appeared. Is part of that. So we need to fund the court service properly. On a recent reform in relation to appointment of judges, there is now CPD and training for judges that's going to be required. And I think that's an important place to engage, particularly like as Eireann talked about and as the IPRT have talked about, the disproportionate impact on women of prison sentences and custodial prison sentences. How many judges are aware of that? How many judges are aware of that? I don't know. Genuine question. And this is where that CPD comes in. So it's about educating judges on the impact, knowing so they too know that 4-month sentences are pointless. They too know this disproportionate impact, and they too know what the alternatives are. But quite frequently in this country, we say, look, let's do the alternative. Let's send them to an alternative without funding the alternatives. So I think if we're talking about sentencing, we have to be bold and fund the alternatives that we want to see, as well as these other pieces.
Thanks, Patrick. And I probably said we could go back a step and fund the services in the community in the first place so that people don't end up in crisis. But yeah, no, I completely agree. And rest assured, IPRT are engaging with the judiciary on this as well. I had a meeting with the president of the district court last week, Paul Kelly. He's very receptive to a lot of the alternatives. And the Department of Justice did publish a report on judicial attitudes to community service and custody just 2 weeks ago. And it is very telling, some of the things that are coming up there. But I think part of it is that judges don't always know what alternatives are available in their area as well. But we do, all of us, I think, have a huge amount of work to do to break those barriers down and ensure that people don't end up in prison when they don't have to. So I suppose going on to the next question then, I suppose we've talked a bit about mental health already. And international human rights experts like the Committee on Prevention of Torture, who was here earlier this year and for last year in 2019, talked about this being one of the most pressing issues for the Irish criminal justice system was mental health in prisons. We've had the Inspector of Prisons publish a thematic inspection report on it, talking about them not being fit for purpose. So I think this is something that we really have to address. And we go in and we do training with recruit prison officers. And one of the things that always comes up is the mental health piece. They are not trained mental health professionals, yet day in, day out, they are having to deal with people in various stages of psychosis or mental health challenges. And if they didn't have a mental health issue when they went to prison, they probably do not share a cell with 3 other people. So we have to actually do something about this. The other point is that we don't have the mental health services available in prison. In September, there were over 2,000 people on the waiting list for psychology services, and at the end of June, there were almost 900 people waiting to access addiction counselling in prison. And I've made the point before but, we're saying 900 people on a waiting list to access addiction services. If the Director General of the IPS is estimating that 70% of people in prison currently have an addiction, that falls well below that, so I'd say we need more. So I suppose the question to candidates then is, what specific strategies does your party propose to address the underlying issues of mental health and addiction, both in preventing imprisonment in the first place and in supporting those already in the prison system? So, Angus, I might go to you first on this one.
I agree with everything you just said in relation to torture. It must be torture for those who have a mental health problem to be locked up in the circumstances that have been described, in circumstances of overcrowding or with others who have other mental health issues. It's not a suitable place, prison, for those who are suffering mental health problems. And you've outlined the 900 who are waiting for counselling. There's so many waiting outside, so there's no mental, not enough mental health services outside or inside prison. And we need to fund it properly. It's not right, it's not fair on those prison officers to be expected to carry the can, or for fellow prisoners to be carrying the can and try, if you want, in an amateur way sometimes, to help those who are suffering episodes, as happens frequently. So it's an investment in mental health services. There should always be those who are trained properly. There should be more counsellors specifically employed by the prison service to address those needs. There shouldn't be a waiting list. You mentioned the fact that the amount of people who are on short sentences, so if they've only started their prison sentence, they're not going to see a counsellor, which is 900, which means the state has an opportunity to engage with those people, and they're not engaged with them. They're not starting anything to treat them, and that means that they will be released back into society as such, into a society that they're still on a waiting list. On the outside, they're still the underlying issues aren't addressed, so that needs to be tackled. There also needs to be a lot more done for after prison services, in particular. The red card.
Yes. She spends all her time at the kids' football matches. Patrick, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, well, obviously there's an issue here in terms of the lack of funding of services, but I think one of the recommendations from the Justice Committee report looking at rehabilitation options within the prison service was to fund the Irish Prison Service to undertake a review of all the mental health supports that are available there. And I think that's a first action that needs to happen, so that we can identify where the weak spots are and where the good practice might be, if there is any. And I shouldn't be so simple, but and where the investment is needed most. So I think that should be a first basic option, so that we can understand the lie of the land, because there's a lack of transparency. And this was one of the things that came up in those sessions, that there was a lack of transparency around supports available to prisoners, and there's a lack of information about it. So such a review, I think, would really help set the ground, so we know where the investment is most needed. I think the addiction side of things as well, like I frequently ask parliamentary questions and campaign on the issue of trying to increase addiction supports within the prison service. And this absolutely has to happen. And again, the drugs policy of the Irish Prison Service is almost 20 years old. And I think that needs to be reviewed. And in reviewing that, we need to embrace the idea that we have to provide proper addiction supports in the prison service. Now, again, we're back to that issue of decriminalisation and a health-led approach, but certainly we need to look at investing in addiction. So I think the addiction counsellors, and it would be a very quick beginning, and the Irish Prison Service review of the mental health supports that are there, so we can know how best to spend money going forward.
Okay, thank you. And Sinead, I'll go to you next.
Great, thanks, Saoirse. And yeah, I mean, I'll give you some of the specifics in our manifesto around this. So to establish a departmental cross-agency panel to bring forward proposals to improve services for mental health and addiction for people in prison, looking at piloting a national clinical programme for dual diagnosis, increased mental health supports, workforce planning to make sure that the staff are there to actually offer these services, not just mental health, but associated ones, increasing investment in housing first, and that pre-release planning for accommodation needs for all people. But overall, we can just boil this down to one word: resources. We have to put the money into this. That's the thing. There are good programs in place. There are good psychological supports in place and treatment programs, but there are simply not enough of them. I mentioned my last role as Chief Commissioner, and I was privileged enough to be in Mountjoy a year or so ago, given the certificates for men who completing courses in prison. And they range from things like, kitchen training, safety training, parenting courses, all of these amazing things. But you cannot get a treatment program. What is the point of, if we're trying to look towards rehabilitation and reintegration, that people can get these qualifications, but can't kick the thing that's either got them there in the first place or that's going to be their biggest barrier to reintegration. So we have to look at that, and in tandem with that, of course, as we first started talking about today, is overcrowding. Because at the moment, that is the barrier to those programs being properly delivered. Because we have overcrowding, parts of the prison system that offer these additional services and supports are being shut down to put in to cater for the increase in numbers that we currently have there. So we have to put the resources there. All of those other steps, absolutely, we need to pursue in our next government. But first and foremost, the money has to go into it.
Thanks so much, Niamh. And Erin, come to you next, and then Jim.
Well, look, I agree with everything that's been said, but I totally agree with resources and help for those in the prison system. But let's flip it a little bit, okay? So somebody has intergenerational trauma in their family. They self-medicate with substance use or misuse, right? They find themselves in homelessness, and then they end up in prison. And that's what's going to happen. What about before all that? What about in the primary school? What about in the area in which they live? Homelessness is a huge issue now. There was a time when mental health and addiction issues forced you into homelessness. Now homelessness is forcing people into mental health stress and addiction issues, which then of course leads to which can lead to incarceration. So yes, it is resources, but it's also stigma within society. The stigma within society that people with mental health issues have or addiction issues have. And I'll give you an example just from this morning, if I might. I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I'll say it anyway. I was listening to Ivan Yea's podcast, and he gave a prediction of two constituencies. He went from Tipperary to Dublin Central, and he spoke about Michael Larry and his chances of winning the election. All right, you're talking about. And then he went to Dublin Central, and he said, well, it would reflect very badly on the people of Dublin Central if they're going to vote for a criminal. What? The guy in Tipperary is a convicted criminal. Do you see the stigma? One type of alleged criminality versus another type of proven convicted criminality. That's the stigma. And again, as we have said 1,000 times in the drugs debate, you can use a disparaging term for somebody who uses drugs in any media outlet, any time of the day or night to get away with it. And that absolutely has to be challenged and changed.
We clearly have a very serious crisis in mental health in this country, particularly youth mental health. Even though the amount of money spent or the budget for mental health services since 2020 has increased by 44%, we still need to spend more. One of the real issues that I and sure other representatives on this panel get repeatedly is complaints from parents trying to access CAMs. But this is an issue even before we get to talk about the prison systems, just in general trying to deal with young people suffering the consequences of mental health. One of the things we have in the manifesto is that we're going to introduce legislation to regulate CAMs and the response from them. In terms of addiction, once a year I go to the Rings In Response to Drugs event where they give out awards to people who've gone through a period of 6 months or a year of drugs. And it is an astonishingly moving occasion. And what really stands out to me is the achievement is remarkable. The ability to be able to get yourself off drugs is an astonishing achievement. So it's not, I know that when people are in prison and if they're there with addiction issues, they need to be treated. Because if they don't get treated whilst they're in prison for addiction, when they come out, as sure as Nightfall say, they're going to inevitably end up back in prison. So like, we really do need a system in respect of where people can get access to addiction services. And maybe you need some sort of a carrot and stick approach in respect of it as well, that maybe if you decide to go along with treatment for addiction, that you will get access to an open prison or issues such as that. So that we need innovative ways in dealing with it. Like anyone here in this room, we know the devastation that drugs causes to the lives of people. Once you get on it, it's extremely hard to get off it. I'm very conscious of what Eireann said about intergenerational trauma. Like as a state, we have an obligation, no matter what the disadvantaged circumstances people are in, we've got to warn children at the youngest age possible the dangers and consequences of drugs.
Thanks so much, Jim. And I'm going to start with Eireann for the next one, but I suppose we've talked about rehabilitation maybe in prison, but let's talk about what rehabilitation and integration looks like when people leave prison. You know, it's essential. Like, we know that unless people get the supports that they need to turn their lives around, the likelihood of reoffending is higher. So, how can people rebuild their lives in the community? Like, if we want safer communities, we want people not to reoffend, then we need to put those facility blocks in place. And I think you've all probably touched on it. But Eireann, what specific measures would Labour put in place to enhance rehabilitation and reintegration services for people leaving prison, including employment support, addiction services and housing assistance? And just to say as well, the Irish Prison Service, in a report to the Minister for Justice, did say that there were a high number of people in prison who were solely still in prison because of their homeless status, because they didn't want to release them into homelessness. So what would Labour do in this regard?
I first of all want to acknowledge that right across every political party there is compassion for this issue. Right? And I'm not trying to pretend the Labour Party has more care and compassion for this issue than anybody else. But I do feel strongly about the stigma issue. All right, about having the wider society understand the nature of imprisonment, the nature of the life, the reasons behind it, the intergenerational trauma, as I mentioned, the issues around addiction and mental health, which have been specified, and the fact that in the majority of cases, in my view, those in prison don't need to be there, and they're not benefiting anybody from being there, and they're certainly not benefiting themselves. So, first of all, we have to reduce the prison population, and therefore, so we shouldn't have in the first place. A lot of this is sort of what I'm talking about is, what we have is a system that really needs radical overhaul. So yes, of course we want to have supports, employment supports, housing supports. But it's I'm just going back to what Jim said there about sort of, people go to drug programs and they come out there, go through recovery successfully. The issue about that is that if you successfully come through recovery, you have to go back and deal with the issues that pushed you into addiction in the first place. So it's not a case of I tried a few drugs and I got addicted to it. There's always, more often than not, a reason that got you that in the first place. And finding yourself on the rough end of the criminal justice system, there tends to be a reason for that as well. So there isn't a one size fits all, but we do need a more compassionate understanding of the nature of people's lives. And I think this sort of, as I think Sinead said earlier, this sort of knee-jerk political response, all right, which I think, I'll be political here for a second, Fine Gael's response to Fianna Fáil's decriminalisation manifesto idea, I think was bang on, because it was classic knee-jerk political reaction. You have a much better politics than that.
Thanks so much. And Jim, what are you next then?
Yeah, well, obviously,
I'll
take any compliment from the other political party. In terms of like the objectives of prison are punishment and rehabilitation, everyone understands the punishment aspect of it. There's uncertainty. People don't realise what the rehabilitative part of it is. Like there's a proposal, I think this should be done, the prison service should be put on a statutory basis. It's not on a statutory basis at present. And I think in that legislation, there should be a statutory recognition that policymakers want to see the role of the prison service, not just in terms of incarceration, but in terms of rehabilitation as well. As I said before, when they get out of prison, we have to ensure that we support people when they get out. And listen, that's difficult, and you can criticise what's government parties or because of the housing situation, it is difficult for people to come out of prison to say that they should be given priority over other people around the housing list. That's just the reality of it. So we need to have supports for people who are coming out of prison, because if we don't do that, it's going to be, I would call them possible in terms of rehabilitation. I also think that in the proposal for open prisons that there should be an express mechanism, and it needs to be stated what's the function of rehabilitation. And probably we as policymakers need to talk about it more. If people understand punishment as a mistake, when it comes to rehabilitation, some people, I suppose depending on the seriousness of the crime, people think it's irrelevant. That was, if we were talking earlier on about 4-month sentences, I agree with what was been said about that. And then I was using the example of murder or rape. In vast majority, you're in the middle of it. So we need to look at the complex, difficult cases as well, and look to see how can we ensure that rehabilitation exists in respect to that. And I think that's why legislatively there should be an impact in terms of what's going to go into the Prison Service Act when we enact it. And it should include a provision on rehabilitation.
Thanks, Jim. Sinead, might come to you next.
So for the Social Democrats, our focus both in this election and if we get into government is on quality public services. Housing, healthcare, childcare, education, disability services. And in doing so, what we're creating is a floor in society below which nobody falls. The current system we have is what I would describe as a safety net, and lots of people float through that net, unfortunately, because it's quite broken. So where those services have been have strayed away from public ownership, we need to bring them back into that state control. And where they've never been, things like childcare, we need to bring them into state control. That's what social democracy is. That's the kind of government we want to run. And that's what we're advocating for. And I mention this here because this is what positive rehabilitation and reintegration looks like. When you can come out from having served your time in prison to know that you will get the health supports that you need, including addiction and mental health supports, and that you will have a home to go to, and that you are not likely to end up on the streets, which is obviously the current situation. And I do agree that stigma is absolutely something that we have to deal with, and again, we need political leadership from that. Not just going to the law and order line all the time, but instead talking about why people end up in prison and what life is like for them after. And I've heard people who've been in prison describe the 2 sentences you get. The sentence that you serve, and then the one that stays with you for the rest of your life. And finally, I want to come back on what Jim mentioned about prison, because I was not in any way suggesting that we don't need more Gardaí on the streets. I fully recognise that we have a recruitment and retention crisis right now in the Irish economy that has to be dealt with. But what I will say is that it is very naive to say that we all think that the Gardaí here in Ireland are a community police force who work with everybody. That was probably my perception growing up. But I am from a Southside affluent neighbourhood. IPRT report that was produced a couple of years ago, the Irish Travellers Access to Justice, will tell you what it's like being a traveller family who are routinely over-policed. If you are a migrant, a person of colour, or simply have the wrong accent or the wrong address, your perception of the police in this country is very, very different, and that's what we're talking about. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Look, again, we're talking about how you make it easier for people leaving prison by not putting them in prison in the first place. I think that is a shared assumption. But I think we need to look at then for those who are in prison, and I'd point out that like 79% of people in 2023 were committed for sentences of 12 months or less. So the majority of people aren't actually in the middle. The majority of people are at that lower end, where they really should not be in prison, or we should be exploring the alternatives. When we had prisoners coming to speak to us at the Justice Committee, again, the things that we were looking at was things about open prisons, temporary release, reforming, like there's no open prison for women, reforming the conditions for temporary release. And I think these allow a slow, a more timed integration. You're not just walking straight out of a very confined area, overcrowded service, back into society. There's greater thing. There's a step down there, and we need to look at step down accommodation, either provided by the Irish Prison Service or the court service, and put the or the Department of Justice to put the responsibility back on them. We all know the problems within the Department of Housing, and many areas there are huge issues with housing. And, you know, if the Department of Justice needs to provide, if prisoners need step-down accommodation, then it's the Department of Justice responsibility to provide that to them. And they can't simply offload it onto the Department of Housing, who are struggling in the best of times as it is. But I think also one of the things we need to look at is the issue of spent convictions. As Sinead said, you know, you get 2 sentences, the one that stays with you. Again, I'd call out Lynn for her good work on the issue of spent convictions. But I think one of the recommendations we made in the Justice Committee was about incentivising employers to take on people with a prison record. But I think the best thing that we can do is actually if the state does that. If the state does that and shows that, look, they are just the same as anyone else who's working, there is no need for this stigma. And as Eireann says, it is a very real stigma. So the state needs to lead by example as well as creating incentives.
Thanks so much, Patrick. So I always do that because people often read flows, but you've all been really good so far. Thanks. And I feel like Lynn should nearly be up here. So we'll get you a seat.
It's going to be so far. This is one of the key issues. In the past, when housing was a bit more available, I'm not saying it was easy, but there was hostel accommodation, there was bed sits. We probably all know different characters who came out of jail and kind of ended up in hostels are accommodation that wasn't suitable. They're definitely not suitable now. They're all overcrowded, have many other issues with them. And the family homes aren't suitable either, because most of the family homes are something that causes in the first instance, or they're overcrowded themselves. So we have to, as a society, it doesn't matter which government comes in, we have to address the housing crisis. The biggest priority in terms of our society and our communities that we have to address. And there is, I believe, a duty of care on the state, on the prison service, and the continuity of care. So when somebody is being released, it's interesting that the comment was made that the governor wasn't releasing some because of their housing situation. That's a good governor, but that's kind of, if you want, an indictment of society and our approaches that people have to be held in prison to give them housing or the roof over their head. That's a bigger scandal than I would have dreamed of. That has to happen. Kind of links and all those organisations that work with people who come out of jail or on temporary release, they need the extra support. They need to be funded to help locate housing, to help those set up a bank account, to get jobs. I work with different charities which are drug rehabilitation schemes in my constituency, and it is one of the issues that's there is that people are looking for grants, whether it's a CD program or we have a lot more work to do on this, but addressing the housing crisis will hopefully address every aspect of housing in our community, and especially for, as we're talking about business today, it's often been forgotten.
Yeah. Thanks, Anderson. Thanks for being here.
I lost me, so I got to
So, in terms of accountability, then this is obviously something that IPRT focuses on quite a lot, and it was one of the reasons why IPRT was set up in the first place. And just to say, we were meant to be having a celebration of our 30th anniversary here today, which is why we had this report. And then the election was called, and we thought, well, sure, nobody's going to come if the election's on, so we repurposed it very, very quickly. So thanks to everyone for agreeing to do it at short notice. But I suppose one of the reasons why we were founded in the first place was that we wanted to shine a light on what happens behind closed, high prison walls. People did not know. We did, and we still do have prison visiting committees, but the public don't really know what goes on behind the prison walls quite a lot. So I suppose accountability is so important, and it's something that all the international bodies bring up time and time again. And at the moment, there is a complaints process or system in prison, but it's not fit for purpose. And I think everyone agrees on that, even the authorities themselves. So I suppose this is particularly relevant in a situation where you have unprecedented overcrowding. You have so many things that people could complain about, and actually they aren't seeing the complaints, and perhaps that's because people don't have faith in the system. So I suppose what I'm going to ask the candidates now is, how would your party ensure greater accountability and oversight within the prison system? And I'm going to start with Jim this one.
Well, as I said earlier on, Saoirse, we need to put the prison service on a statutory basis, and I think that will be of assistance in terms of establishing accountability. When you have processes that are informal or ad hoc, I think they're open to inconsistency, and people don't know how effectively they operate. We saw with the parole board there was lots of uncertainty. I think it's been improved since the legislation was enacted. We also will need, in terms of the issue of OPCAT, we need to enact the inspection of places that are potentially ill. That was the general scheme that was published back in 2022. It came before the Justice Commission for pre-legislative scrutiny. I think that was concluded in 2023. As government TD, I'm disappointed that that legislation wasn't introduced into the Oireachtas, let alone enacted since then. But I think that's going to have to be a priority for the new government coming in. In terms of prison complaints, at present, as you know, regulated under the prison rules. The prison rules themselves obviously are a statutory instrument. They also probably need to be updated a little bit in the context of the enactment of the legislation on the prison service. That will happen. But there is a benefit in order to people know what's the procedure for somebody who wishes to make a complaint in respect of what's happening to them in prison. It should be set out clearly so that the public is aware of how it operates, and obviously prisoners and prisons themselves are aware how it operates as well.
Great, thanks. Patrick?
Yeah, so I think we absolutely should ratify OPCAT, and I think we're all in agreement to that. And the thing was, as Jim says, the legislation went back, did the pre-legislative scrutiny, and went back to the Department of Justice and installed. But the thing is, we don't need the legislation to ratify OPCAT. The Department of Justice has a position that they won't ratify OPCAT until everything is in place. But OPCAT allows a 3 or 5 year transitional period in which to get the things in place. So let's ratify OPCAT now, and then we can continue on with the legislation. We don't need to wait for that legislation. But absolutely, we need independence for the Office of the Inspector of Prisons. And again, that's part of the legislation that we were talking about and dealing with the Justice Committee. But if we look at the issue of the DOCA Centre, there's been 4 or 5 reports there, of which only 1 has actually been published. And the rest are sitting in a drawer in the minister's desk, gathering dust, and God only knows what's actually in them. And there was probably very serious things there, because one of them was an initial inspection, and then the follow-on was a specific inspection ordered by the minister. So she is that concerned that she's ordering a special inspection. So what the hell is in these reports that she's refusing to release them? So the fact that the Office of the Inspector of Prisons has the power to go in and inspect and cannot say what's actually happening and is essentially gagged is a huge problem. So that can be reformed very quickly. We can pass OPCAT very quickly, and then we can do the detailed work on the legislation to enact OPCAT properly later on. But certainly I think if we are talking about accountability, reform of the Office of Inspector of Prisons, even just allowing them to publish the reports themselves without the consent of the minister could be done very quickly.
Great, thanks. Sinead, I'll go to you next.
Sure, yeah, and I'll pick up on Patrick's point immediately about the delay, because it's not just OPCAT, there are other areas where the state policy of having to be ready before you'll ratify anything. CRPD is the other one where we've seen huge delays, and obviously following the whole government term where they've talked about it, that will be actually come into force the day after the election, leaving it for the next government to actually deal with those access to justice issues. But I think, I compare it to, if you're in life and you want to have a baby and you sat down and you budgeted out for it, you would never actually say, I'm ready to have a baby. You just wouldn't. And that's what these UN conventions are like. You were never going to be, as a state, all ready to say, snap your fingers and now we're good. The whole point of them is that they're aspirational. And absolutely, you ratify them and then you work towards them. And Ireland is so delayed in multiple areas on this issue, and it has to be addressed and named. The NPM, the National Preventive Mechanism of the OPCAT protocol, is potentially the biggest game changer that we'll see. I think the former UN Special Rapporteur said exactly those words, that it is the biggest single mechanism you can make as a state to prevent torture in any jurisdiction. It will redefine our understanding of detention. It will affect all of the areas that we've discussed today, because it allows for both announced and unannounced visits, but it also allows for the public dialogue around detention, around torture, in not only prisons, but other areas, in healthcare settings, in direct provision, in so many areas that we don't think of as detention right now. I spoke to other institutions who deal in this area, and they spoke about boarding schools, for example, and witch camps in Mongolia. Fascinating stuff around that. But it really is such a game changer, and we have to pursue it. We saw during COVID this wonderful story about how we handled infection control in our prison system, and there was so little discussion around what it meant for the rights of those people who were living in prison at the time and their families. And if OPCAT had been there, if that NPM had been in effect at that stage, none of that would have happened. We would have had the mature dialogue that we needed to have at that time.
Okay, thank you. Angus, I'll come to you next. And then Dale.
Yeah, I think we're very reluctant often to embrace EU directives, and sometimes rightly so, but in this instance, there is no excuse whatsoever. We shouldn't be afraid of it. We should fully embrace, and we should act on it, drop the timetable, and implement it in full. There's no reason on earth that there shouldn't be more transparency. The only reason you don't have transparency in the prison system is not you have something to hide, but that's the conclusion. There's no other reason. If everything was right, then you would open up the doors. If you wanted more supports and you wanted to make the case for the state to address overcrowding, then you'd be happy to allow inspections. And the inspector of prisons should always be allowed to have unannounced visits and to be independently publishing the reports, given that that's the job they've had for years. Many years ago, since I engaged with the inspector of prisons and those who are on visiting committees, and they always had harrowing tales. They also had good things. They were able to point out to governors who were working to improve situations, who were hamstrung by lack of investment or by obstacles from the department. So we need that openness, and we need to enact on, not just enact, but to implement our passion.
Okay, thanks. And then Dale.
Yeah, I'll be brief on this one. I agree with what's been said about OPCAT. I think I'm possibly unique here that I actually was a junior minister for a while. I'm actually reflecting on the fact that most of the grandson of a prisoner who escaped prison 100 years ago. So that's why we have a common. Yeah. Big thing for actually.
Two compliments. They're looking to go to college.
Anyway, no, I think the issue about being minister is that sometimes people have the perception that politicians can do everything. What politicians have to deal, ministers and governments have to deal with is the civil service, is the public service, and the civil service who can often be, particularly the Department of Justice, who can be particularly difficult. If they don't want to do something, it can be almost impossible unless you're completely on the case all day long. I mean, in terms of application, we had a similar one when I was a Minister of State, and the Shades outline, the view of the permanent government of civil service, that well, countries all over the world ratify these things. It's meaningless. In Ireland, we ratify it means something because we have all the legislation in place, of course. I don't think that's good enough. We absolutely have to do doing so in terms of putting the prison system on standard. But the fact it's not on standard is really something that's it's not sustainable. And I do feel, as Patrick alluded to, we have had so many issues in guards, women of honour, various different agencies of the state who have had issues with culture and abusive culture. And I think we have to have a kind of culture audit within the Irish prison service as well, because it's not good enough that it takes sometimes a pioneering journalist to come up with a list of issues within any service. And that's not to undermine the great work that's goes on in prisons by well-meaning people who are in the system, we need to have a culture on so we can see exactly what the day-to-day realities are for people living and working in the prison system.
Thanks. And there is a bill actually, the Irish Penal Service Bill, we appeared before the Justice Committee again for pre-reg scrutiny. I don't, there's ourselves and Prison Officers Association, so there wasn't much to it. But I think we would hope to see that in the next Dáil come back again. And that's great to hear all of your support for the inspection of places of detention body. That's something that needs to happen sooner rather than later. It's been sitting there for quite a while now. I know we had given you a number of questions, but we do have a little bit more time and then I'll go to the audience. One thing that I did want to pick up there, Sinead, you mentioned children and families, and a few of you have mentioned it as well. But I suppose we in IPRT do have a Children and Families Initiative because we know how important that is. We also know that maintaining family contact for somebody who is in prison is the golden thread to help them rehabilitate and come out and feel supported and want to do better for their children. That's what people have told us. So just in terms of what your party would do if you were elected and you influence the next programme for government, what would be in there about supporting families and particularly children who have a family member in prison, whether that's a parent? And I know a number of you have touched on the issue of women in prison as well, and IPRT would have published a report on maternal imprisonment. And it is a particularly stark piece, and we've done a lot of work with the CL project on this as well, hearing from them directly about what that impact has. But we've also heard from men about the impact that it has. I was on Chat Navy last Halloween with men who'd never had one-on-one time with their child, and for the first time, in fairness, the IPS, they facilitated that. So it is a big issue, and it's something we really want to see addressed, and it's almost invisible. We do have a commitment now in the new Young Ireland, the policy framework for children and young people, about finding out how many of these children there are, because we don't even know. So, Sinead, I'll start with you there, and then we might go down the table that way and come back to Patrick. So if we go Sinead, Jamie, Patrick, and Elizabeth.
So I think one of the things we have is to develop an interdepartmental strategy to specifically support children who have a parent in prison. But here's where I do think we need to examine what we mean by deprivation of liberty. Because when people go to prison, there is no reason why they should be entirely cut off from their families, particularly now when we have different modes of communication than we had when prisons were formulated as a concept. So I think we do need to look at that. We need to look at open prisons. We need to look at prisons specifically for women who can actually remain with their families. And I think there's some of them being pioneered in the UK now, where they can stay with their young families and serve their sentence, but not be separated. Particularly where, and I'm a single mom myself, particularly where you are the only carer in a child's life. So I think it's about, it's just about putting certainly a lot of different departments behind this in terms of developing a strategy, but also being more innovative and creative and really challenging as a society how we think about prison and how we can be much more progressive in our penal policies in this country to make sure that we're not, because as you say, that lifeline, keeping people motivated to do the treatment programs, to think about reintegration and think about rehabilitation, that's what our focus should be. Like we mentioned earlier, I think it was about punishment and rehabilitation. I mean, the reality is that in a prison setting, the primary focus is always security. And because of that, those other things fall aside. And that only changes when you look at things like open prisons and different types of custodial settings. So that's where we need to be, not just thinking about the high security element of it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I remember my past life as a teacher and as a principal of a school, I would be honest and enjoy dragging people out for day release, for communions and confirmations. And the child would be so anxious that this big day in their lives that normally was would be able to join them. I mean, from a middle class background that I'm from Ireland, you are completely removed from this day-to-day reality of what other people go through. And then you can just imagine this beautiful 7-year-old, 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old girl, what relationship she's going to have with the state, with the authority, the guards, into the future if daddy can't make enough of it. It is profoundly wounding to her sense of citizenship, her sense of respect, for the smallest gesture for Daddy to be able to come and spend that day with her. And I think, as others have said, I mean, Jim mentioned Ringsend, I'm hugely influenced by the SAIL project in North Strand. Those incredible women who first spoke to me about, oh, you're here? Oh, great. Hi, yeah. who first spoke to me about the nature of what they have, the fears they have about if I go into treatment, will my kids be taken off? Even if I go into treatment for my addiction, if there's a custodial setup, what that means to break up with my family. And I just don't think middle class Ireland, middle Ireland, the judiciary, politics, I think, and quite a number of people in the gardens as well, don't really understand the massive lifelong trauma that will cause to a child. And if they did, you just wouldn't do it the way they were doing it.
In the manifesto, as I mentioned earlier, Saoirse, we've indicated that consideration will be given to establishing an open women's prison. I'd like to see that. I'd like to see it happen. I suppose the benefit of that would be that the bond between mother and child, if a mother was in prison, could be maintained much more strongly through the openness of the prison. And obviously, our relationship between mother and child is something that is so significant. And it's devastating, I think, for any parent to contemplate not having access to their child as a result of imprisonment. In terms of this, one of the benefits of this as well is you get to listen to ideas, which they've made a very valuable point here in terms of facilitating other types of communication and contact, in terms of remote communication. We don't see why there should be any prohibition in respect of reasonable remote communication between the prisoner and the family. It's obviously very traumatic. It requires some level of expertise, I would have thought, as well, from people who are probably qualified than me in respect of child psychology and maintaining of a relationship. But this is something that probably I was right, most people don't reflect upon the consequence of it. But certainly I think the open women's prison is a mechanism whereby we can retain the contact and vital bond between the mother and child at a early stage.
Yeah, so again, there'll be this broad agreement here, but I think, if we're looking, as the Justice Committee has recommended, about open prisons and open prison for women, reviewing the use of temporary release, these are all important. The work you guys are doing as well on how the house of detention model, I think, is really important, because Mountjoy being in the city centre might be accessible for a lot of people from Dublin, but if you are in a prison, if you are sentenced to a prison that's nowhere near where you live, that's going to impact on the ability of somebody even to visit you, even before we take on what Sinead's talking about in terms of new ways of communication and maintaining those bonds. So I think that house of detention model is very important for maintaining those family and societal connections, which then will, of course, spider web into all the other things we've been talking about. But I think also, one of the things I look at is in Dublin South Central, we have the Fusion Community Prison Link service, which provides community prison link workers into prisons. And they're running a reach out program which is aimed to maintain the bonds between male prisoners and their children. So I think that there are services there that can be copied, that can be replicated, that can be resourced properly. And I think if we look around Europe, there are a lot of countries that do prison significantly more better and significantly more rehabilitative. And I think we can easily learn lessons from them. One thing that I've been talking about in the last few years, of course, is access to in-cell technology. So, a simple computer where prisoners can use. For me, it was mostly around so that they could engage in education and have access to educational courses and something to do their assignments on for that educational course. In-cell technology, of course, will facilitate the sorts of things Sinead was talking about. So I think that in-cell technology is something we should absolutely look at rolling out. And again, as we develop and modernise the prison prison accommodation. And I think, a combination of open prisons, house of detention, and wider use of in-cell technology will have multiple benefits, not just in this area, but others too.
Thanks, Patrick. Angus?
Yeah, I don't think judges ever intend that somebody being in prison would break up one of the only things that's stable in many of those who are convicted lives. And that's the relationship with their children or their partner. That isn't the intention. The intention, as outlined before, was penal, yes, but reform as well. If you start off on the basis that you're breaking up a family, breaking up the relationship, that can add to that disillusion with society and with clash with society. So more needs to be done to help maintain those parental links in particular, but also with partners. I think there needs to be more visits. I was asking for a visit recently for a prisoner who was on remand. I've asked the wife, and she says, "Oh no, that's only half an hour this week." This is to somebody who hasn't been convicted. And so we've got to help with the issue that those who are on remand are not convicted, in many cases shouldn't be in jail. But day release should be used a lot more, and it shouldn't be withdrawn for whatever reason. And I think it's one of the things that's devastating for kids, especially, but devastating for a prisoner who's built themselves up for a family visit or family vacation and that. So the whole process needs to be more family friendly. And that's no problem in terms of looking at how new technology can be used to help. It might be to help with homework, it might be something else. And it might be that we need to look at whether ankle bracelets can be used for somebody who wants to visit the children playing football. It might be an important football match, or it might be just a normal football match or an event. And that might be something that could be looked at with the agreement of the person themselves. We've got the
Thanks, Angus. So we're going to open it up to the floor. Thanks all for your answers. I'm sure there'll be more come out of it. So any questions? I see this man at the back first.
How you doing? Brandon McGee again, because
Sorry, I have a...
in Dublin. I don't need that, I don't think.
You do, yes. You do.
Oh, sorry. I sound the same. How you doing? Brandon McGee, community prison links with casting from Dublin 122. Look, I enjoyed listening to you guys. And for me, Aidan touched on it. Really, like, for me, working in the prisons every day, looking at guards, judges, no matter who it is, I think what we lack in our society is education of the emotions. And I truly, truly believe that this has to be prioritized with radical change in our education system. That children are taught about their emotions at a very, very early age. If you speak to a child about their experience in school, they will speak, and they won't speak academically. They'll talk about how that made me really happy. I was really sad about that. I was really angry about that. You get me? So I think it's so important because in our classrooms right now are our future prisoners, our future prison officers and governors, our future politicians. And I know, as you said about judges. Judges do react off their emotions as well on the day. You know, and if that's an argument at home or whatever, we bring it into the workplace all the time. And as we really, really radically look at that stuff, and that's across the board in our society. I know as an ex-prisoner and a recovering drug addict for many, many years, I went to college, actually me and Sinead done the same master's together. But I mean, it's just so important because it said already that you have to go back there to move forward and look at that underlying stuff, that's why it's causing it. Right? So I just want to ask the panel, what do you think of that idea? That idea that we radically have to look at the education of emotions with our children.
Great, I might take a couple of questions before I go to the panel. Neve and Ollie, and then we do two, and then we do, I think there's probably another three in the room. Actually, but we'll do three for now, and then.
So my name is Neve, I'm from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. My question is something that I've touched on a couple of times, but I just want to see what the panel thinks specifically about pre-trial detention and the numbers of people being held in remand custody. ICCL did a project earlier this year looking at people being held in remand. And we did a number of interviews with legal practitioners, solicitors and barristers, and they were speaking about the effect that the delays in the court system is having on the amount of time that people are spending in remand custody, which has an effect on how those people decide to plead. So there are people who are pleading guilty because they'll be spending less time in prison through their sentence than they would be waiting for their trial on remand custody. So just to kind of connect it back, people in pre-trial detention are in Toker Hill Prison, which is chronically underfunded and overcrowded. There's, like you mentioned earlier, very difficult to get access to the prison. It's also out in, a part of Dublin that's incredibly difficult to get to. There's, I could go into the facilities of it that are an issue.
Let's leave them time to
Just essentially to ask a question about, prisoners being held for remand and the delays in the system that are leading to them being held for long.
That's great. Pauline is next, and then we'll take answers from the panel, try and keep them short, and then we'll come back and
Pauline Conroy. I wanted to ask the panel, particularly Fianna Fáil and the Green Party who have been in government, their position on prisoners' rights, because since 2020, sections of the prison rules have been suspended, removing the right of prisoners to have regular visits, the right to have visits in person, the right to have education, the right to go to the gym, and the right, in fact, to interact with the world outside prison. And this was done under a statutory instrument which slipped through the Dáil very sneakily, SI 250, and despite writing to different political parties, I can still not understand how this suspension of basic prison rules has been allowed to continue for so long. It's outrageous. It's a breach of Ireland's signature of international conventions and agreements that prisoners' rights at a minimum would conform to the articles which the population believe that prisoners have and which they don't have.
Thanks, Pauline. I suppose what you're referring to there was brought in during COVID, but it didn't mention COVID. It did mention infectious diseases, and there was no sunset clause, and it's never been repeated as far as we're aware. Who wants to go first on those? So we have education of emotions, remand, and those limitations that piece there. So we could, okay. Sinead?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I'll try and keep it quick because I know we want to get more questions and to hear from everyone. And I absolutely agree, Brendan, and we learned a lot about that in our quality studies programme. I mean, I would say I do think my daughter was 24 yesterday, and I've learned so much from her in terms of mental health. And I think we have. I mean, I don't take much credit, but as a generation, I do think we can take some credit for starting to destigmatise mental health and starting to get to a point where we can talk about our emotions. We're nowhere near that in terms of addiction. I'm 13 years sober on New Year's Eve. And there are so many people in our society who don't feel comfortable saying that, who don't feel comfortable talking about their addiction. And it goes back to our two double standards here, where we see addiction as certain categories of people, and we don't treat the addiction in affluent parts of our society. So we've a lot of work to do, and I do agree that in the curriculum we need to address that. In terms of pre-trial detention leave, I fully agree with you that it's just not good enough. And not only that, but it is affecting exactly as you say, the lives of people and the opportunities for them. We need effective legal aid for people, and that reform cannot happen soon enough, and proper resourcing it. And we need to make sure that we just don't go down the route of the US system, where the intricacies of the system itself are what actually inform the outcomes for people. And finally then putting on the prisoners' rights issues and the erosion of it since SL 250, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the idea that the Irish Prison Service was the overseer of its own changes, that's essentially what happened. And a couple of people have talked already about putting the Irish Prison Service on statutory footing. We have to do a lot more than that. We have to look at, I led an agency in this state which had independence and resources enough to hold to account the state on its human rights and equality obligations. But IREC is an outlier in terms of that independence and that resourcing. It is so unusual, and it is because of the UN criteria and the EU criteria for designation of a national human rights institution and a national equality body. But there are multiple agents and organisations in this state, primarily in the criminal justice sector, but elsewhere as well, that don't have enough independence from their parent department, as they call it. They don't have the budgetary independence that they need to hold anybody to account. So all of that has to happen in terms of, and that's why the MPF and OPCAT will be such a game changer for it. I mean, we spoke about the report earlier that the Irish Prison, or the Inspector of Prisons came out with a few years ago on mental health, but the only reason that was able to be published is because of their partnership with the Mental Health Commission at the time. They were able to get into the prisons, and then the Commission were able to publish it. So the fact that our regulatory bodies can't even publish their own findings at the moment is, again, as we've heard earlier, such an indictment on this country.
Thanks. The next hand I saw was there on then Dr.
Yeah, look, in the interest of time, it was fully agree with Sinead on the last 2 points. And indeed, your first point, I found the first point to think raising about children. I mean, children feel humiliated. Okay, poverty makes them feel humiliated. Inequality makes them feel humiliated. They learn very early on that their accent just isn't good, where they're from just isn't good, and they don't fit in. And how that compounds over as they grow up means it impacts on the relationship with the state and agencies of the state. All right, it does. It's something that I worry about, and I saw firsthand. We have to talk a bit about literacy. I mean, we have 19% of the Irish adult population have functional literacy issues. Okay, that blocks you out from fully participating in Irish society. That's 1/5 of Irish adults who couldn't read, let's say, a menu or an application form. And just like you said about being sober, lots of people with literacy issues, not that they haven't said they have. And it's also come back to children again. I talk about children's literacy or their own language capacity. 2 3-year-olds, right? Disadvantaged 3-year-old, more advanced 3-year-old. 400 words, 1,200 words, age 3. And then we ask the education system fill the gap. So it's not just about children, it's actually about the whole family unit. And like, I know it's not about overlapping issues here, but maternal depression is a big issue. COVID caused havoc in our communities. The number of attempted suicide amongst mammies was often scaled underreported. So I think we need a bit more compassion and understanding, and let God can I actually say the word love in a political discussion about the nature of childhood, children, humiliation, the potential for it, because if we get it wrong, it's not lasting, and they can act out. And to be honest, people just complain if they mention the experiences, maybe that they have done, maybe any of us would have the exact same reaction.
Patrick, you were next.
Yeah, in relation to the education of emotion, certainly there have been a lot of people who've been advocating for a citizen assembly on education. And I think that could be very useful for highlighting that the issue that, what is the purpose of the education system? What are we trying to achieve? And to pick up all those things. What are the challenges it has to face? How can the state address all the things that Eireann has highlighted there? So I think a citizen assembly on education could really help explore all those. The risk is, like other citizens' assemblies, that it leaves the citizens' assemblies with great ideas and goes to the building around the corner, and it becomes a little slower to be implemented. The delays in the remand system is a huge, in the court system is a huge problem. This is a very significant one of them. And the thing is, yes, legal aid is important, but it's not going to speed up the delays. We need to invest in our court system. We need judges. We need more judges. And judges can be appointed very quickly out of the thousands of barristers that are there at the minute. There's a lot of courtrooms that, the circuit court comes into once a week and isn't used the rest of the week. So there's capacity in the system there. We can appoint judges very quickly. We need the registrars. We need the court service people to go with them. And as I highlighted earlier, we aren't investing in the court service. They don't have enough staff as it is to reach the number they think they need, and I think that number is wrong. I think they need about double that. In relation to the COVID restrictions and lingering, that is a huge problem. I can't answer that. I wasn't the Minister for Justice. I don't know what happened there, but it absolutely should change, and I think that's a very important thing, that if any of us are elected, it should be one of the first things that we're seeking change on in any negotiations.
Can I just ask for show of hands on who would repeal that if they can? Thanks. I'll hold you on to it. So that's great, thanks Patrick for that. Jim, I know you had your hand.
Good. Just say to Brendan, 2 years ago, Linda Rowan, as you mentioned previously, asked me to go up to Mount Joy for the purpose of.
Well, I like that as a non-escape from enjoyment.
Anyway, she brought me up there, and as always, it was a very interesting event that Linda had organised. I won't go into detail about it, but what was the real memory for me is that in advance of it starting, I was sitting down with a man, I think he was in his mid-30s, doing a very serious offence he was in prison for. But out of the blue, he just started talking to me and said, all his life he had been taught that anger and violence was the mechanism by the way he could resolve his problems. And he said his father taught him that, and what was making him physically anxious and restless was that he was now realising for the first time that this is not the way to deal with it. But can I also say it's not just people in prison who have difficulties controlling their emotions. You know, we can see it in the world of politics. People can't understand how to respond to situations. Now, I agree with you. Of course, we should educate people about their emotions. I don't know who is to do that, but we put a lot of responsibility on our schools, but it certainly is something that's beneficial. People need to realise they have to respond calmly to challenges that we all face in life, you know. In terms of what Niamh said, there has been a significant increase, Niamh, in the number of central criminal judges. There's now 12 central criminal courts sitting. We're going to have prisoners who are on remand for serious offences. That's a consequence of the Bail Act. It's also what the people voted for back in 1997. I'm conscious of, I'd be extremely disturbed if people were changing their pleas on the basis of the fact that they can't get a trial on it. I'd like to look to see what the evidence is there. And Paulie, in terms of any rules that were introduced for COVID, I would have thought they should be removed since fortunately COVID is gone. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I'd be very brief. I think everybody has already on my report. But the focus of the education system should be on academia and academic excellence. It should be on building better human beings from the start. There's a lot of work happening in primary schools at the moment. There's a lot of brilliant teachers there who are kind of changing or helping young people kind of changing out of what maybe society had allocated for them in the past. So hopefully that continues. In terms of the pre-trial detention and the delays, it's sentencing by remand. That can't continue. And one of the ways of addressing is that you don't have people on remand in prison in the first place, unless they're very, very violent, unless they've breached barring orders on the lands. Where there has to be a way of ensuring people aren't held on remand in any circumstances for undue delay. There are cases up to 3 years that I know of where people are on remand. Communities know a lot worse. So that's absolute scandalous. Justice needs to be seen to be done, but it has to be done quickly. In terms of the prison rules, just statutory instruments, it's the gift of the Minister. It's not the Dáil that passed it, but obviously we did pass, and the COVID legislation didn't understand or didn't probably got a commitment that this was only temporary to deal with COVID, and kind of in this instance it wasn't, so it should be rescinded immediately.
Thanks for all that. And just to say, IPRT will be doing a piece of work that builds on the ICCL work around the reasons behind the high rate of remand, so we will be starting that when we are finishing that piece. I did see Paula's hand. I saw the lady at the back's hand, and then this gentleman. If people could keep it to a question, because we are running out of time. I did tell them to be out of here at 4 o'clock, and we'll see what we can do. So Paula, I'll go and this lady. Oh, well, no, actually, if you want to go first, then, sorry, we've got the microphone. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Mon. So I'm a case manager. I work with women who are coming out from prison. So we do rehabilitation and reintegration. It's called active programs, one of the course programs. And most of the women coming in, like they said, short sentences, 3 months, 4 months. And coming into the program is a massive program. And I think one of the things, if not all, would be said to me as a case manager, like, really traumatizing. Like, this offense could have been committed 4 or 5 years ago, and they had to wait for 6 years to get the sentence. I remember a young lady who committed this offense at 18, and she was sentenced at 23. She spent 3 months in the doctors, had to give up her property and everything, and return back to homelessness. So that is one thing. And I think the judges as well, I don't know, like, we know they have problem with sentencing and the delay. If sometimes they could just, part of educating themselves about women needs as well is a big thing. So I want that to be looked into as well. What they're going to do about women with short sentences, how to give up their children, their accommodation.
Thank you. And Paula, next.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I was just, to be unfortunate about the Citizens Assembly, it was just a bit disappointing to hear parties talk about decriminalisation but leaving out cocaine and heroin. When you look at the prison system, the majority of women and men that come in there, they are the drugs that do tend to get them in there and on those sentences. But in regards to women, like if you look at the 90s, there was about 150 women in prison, and that's tripled since then. I would have been one of them women in the 90s. I go into the prison now walking, and some of them women that I've been in there with are still in and out there. They're basically doing life sentences in installments. You know, it's just constant revolving door system. So rather than looking at building more prison spaces, open prisons, which is a great idea, closer on the ones you haven't opened, with the numbers that are there now, and only for violent crimes, women shouldn't be in prison because it's destroying whole families. But if you're going to, say, invest into community-based organisations, like really resource them, but go back to the way seeing schemes and all was in the past. Like women come out, and if their only means of getting extra money was the shoplift or whatever it is, that helps support them. Start looking at the way seeing schemes were based in the 90s, where women could attend a program that could support them on their road to recovery, but also they got the double payment that they did not need to go out and shoplift. That supported them along it. Well, once austerity came, that just took that away, and that was never replaced by the state. Is there any way we can go back to that?
And if you can keep your question really short, because I think this is going to have to be the last one, and if you want to come to
We're just talking, what she highlights today is the problem with our justice system, promise reform of our justice system. Now, the area you're coming up with as well today is mental health. And one of the failings, I think, of our justice system is on the ground policing and recognising mental health issues from a lot of different areas, from, say, the people that are causing mental health to others, that are not acting appropriately within things, but more so the people that need help. If people need help, they should be noticed at policing level, and they should be given the help needed, and it would prevent them from ending up in places like prison. Where is the failing? Is it in the justice system, or is it on the ground policing, or where would you feel it would work well?
Thank you. So I will start with Dennis this time because he's been last a couple of times there. So, and then whoever else wants to go.
I'll try this in reverse order. Just catch up your name.
That is my name.
Just the model of helping the community. So mental health, years ago, people were locked away and who had different mental health issues, and then society changed, and we were supposed to help those who had mental health difficulties in the community. It was never resourced, still not resourced. And so whether it's the Gardaí, whether it's me, whether it's you, or it's the neighbour identifies people with mental health issues are getting worse, or We need also to be resources that we can help or identify those people who are best placed to look after those. And so that doesn't escalate, doesn't become something that breaks out. It could be neighbours dispute, it could be something worse, and it ends up exacerbated. The person ends up in prison for a violent offence in some cases, or it might be something else altogether. So, but I think I know there is a need to invest in community mental health services to help our communities deal with the issues that are in terms of the double payment. It's something that was removed. Not only was it made difficult for those who are coming out of prison, it was made difficult for anybody who were trying to wear a family application. It also made it very difficult for a lot of CE programs around this city anyway, because that's the ones I know, because they were dependent on people such as those that you mentioned who wanted to help their communities, because most CE programs are helping their communities. And the problem was the model is wrong. It's community employment, which is supposed to progress into something else, rather than support the person and support the community. It's a misnomer. In terms of rehab and reintegration of the judges should take into account time on remand, not just time on remand if you're in prison, time on remand if you're outside as well. And maybe if the time in remand is shortened by the employment of extra judges and the whole staff and the whole system being speeded up, then we might have that. But it is particularly stark when part of the sentence is you're sentenced to imprisonment, but the consequence of that in this day and age is that you lose your home. It's not just you, it's your family. And that needs to be taken into account by the judges. The other kind of issues that come with a sentence, it's not just that you're sentenced to loss of liberty, but there are other consequences. Sometimes I don't think they understand that.
That's great. And so we might just go down to going back on to Patrick. And you can also say if you agree with somebody, those political questions, but if you want to save time, we can do it that way. So maybe touch on something that hasn't been covered before, if you wouldn't mind, Sinead.
I think, it's great to hear strong voices here advocating for the rights of women who are in prison and the specific experience that they have. And I suppose just to build on Angus's answer around those austerity measures, that was a government that set us back, unfortunately. I've done a lot of work with lone parents and people who share parenting out of share of one family, and that's another area where we saw so many cuts to the sports budget for lone parents, and we have never recovered from that. And exactly like we've heard from Paula, what it results in is that there are negative incentives to engaging in training or education or any of those types of things. And we have so much work to do, because as we've seen, apparently this recovery, economic recovery in our country since those austerity measures, we have many of us who are working in the areas that we do have seen that there are so many communities who have no sight of that recovery, and we have a lot of work to do to deal with it. And I think going back to my original point around the fact that we need these services in place, and I think specifically when we talk about mental health, like there's the services that we should have in a social democracy, where you pay your taxes and you expect in return a suite of quality public services that mean that you don't have the stress of living at risk of poverty, that you don't have the fear of what it means to not be able to access the appropriate healthcare and mental health care in particular that you need. This is what we need to work towards as a society, and that's our focus in this election, and will be our focus in the government.
Next to you, Pam.
Yeah, I'll make some general comments as well in response to what's been said. Just on decriminalisation, I think what the political system has to do is to realise we're talking about decriminalisation of the person, okay, of the person. It doesn't matter what that person is taking or addicted to, it's a decriminalisation of the person, and that person does not belong in the criminal justice system, as long as you're facing a nurse, a doctor, a counsellor. And I think I mentioned it before, but the knee-jerk political reaction from some parties was really stunningly disappointing, because many of us have been working together across the bureaucracies to drag the system to a position where we can actually move forward or touching stuff. I'll just make a general comment. I remember knocking on a door not too long ago, and a chap came to the door and said, "Oh, we were talking about you work today." I said, "Oh, really, where do you work?" "The Duchess prison." I said, "Okay, yeah, one of our residents was talking about it, and I was able to name the person immediately. It was a pretty good guess, and I was right." And I remember thinking, that girl, if she was in my class, that girl has 4 kids. She's just not the one who's in prison. 4 kids are in prison as well, effectively. And there's no I don't know what she has done, but whatever she did, the disproportionate damage that has been done to that woman and those children as a result of whatever she had done was inescapable for me. It's not serving anybody, and I can only imagine it's not improving that young woman's relationship with, authority, and it's certainly going to fundamentally, I keep saying, damage those 4 kids. But I go back to what I said at the beginning. When I used to be a school principal and these kids used to come down to me and they'd have a row. The reason for the row wasn't that she stole her pen or she was going to be funny or whatever, or she won't play with me. That wasn't the reason for the row. The reason was they hadn't had their breakfast. And that, to me, is what the nature of crime is really all about. It's rarely actually about the crime. It's about the reason the crime happened in the first place. We talk a lot about this, but not enough about this.
Yeah.
And I think maybe if we all did, we might be in a better position.
And Laura, I know what you state about the criminal justice system. It's too slow, like I mentioned earlier on, in respect of the prosecution of serious indictable offences. That has speeded up, but obviously there's going to be a certain amount of delay in respect to that because you have to put together the public evidence. In terms of summary offences, we need to speed them up much more in Ireland. And this shouldn't be dragging on for lengthy periods of time. Summary offences should be dealt with promptly. Paul, I know what you say about decriminalisation. Like there's the policy is, as was set out there, in respect of, we now say in respect of cannabis, as well. The purpose of it is what we're saying is that there should not be a criminal sanction applied to a person found in possession of a small amount of cannabis. I think it's an interesting proposal. I know what says in respect of the response to it. I know what you said about the CE schemes. I can't really guarantee how we introduced, but I'm interested to hear what you say about it, and that's certainly something that should be looked at again. And Pat, in terms of mental health, we want to detect problems that people have with mental health at the earliest stage possible. So we need to be detecting before Gardaí get involved, before people are sentenced. It should really be at a stage where the manifestation of mental health issues are showing themselves. And unfortunately, it appears to be at an early stage in people's lives, so it's good resource and counselling. Thanks.
So actually, I want this question, just dig into heroin and cocaine shouldn't be used for cannabis at all. And you avoided the cannabis one week off.
Yeah, well, that's
like technically I was kind of on that.
what we don't support the decriminalisation of heroin and cocaine.
The party did that justice study and at the drug use assembly and citizen study.
Yeah. Well, just saying what the manifesto said.
All the lived experience that stood on that stage, I was one of them, was talking to lived experience from heroin, from crack cocaine, and they're the ones that's the most impacted negatively in terms of, even if you look at, just say, drug policy does more damage to communities than the actual drugs do. So it shouldn't really matter what the drug is, it shouldn't matter the impact it has on the person and on the community as a whole. Like, you can't say you support decriminalisation and looking at Portuguese drug policy or any of it, when I've been to Porto, I spoke to the chief of police, I've been to the Department of Health, they decriminalise all drugs, and it works really well.
Mm-hmm.
And it has, fixed so many issues within the community. Yes, there are issues with it, but people are going to take drugs regardless. We need to be drawn up about it. So what it seems to, and I can tell you from a lot of people use drugs, I haven't used drugs in 15 years, but I engage with people every day. I work in services with people use drugs. And what it seems like is, when you look at, we've had the Citizens Assembly, we've deviated from it. We've got same-sex marriage. Again, when you talk about these stigmatizing people who use drugs, this is just another people different because you're re-stigmatizing people who use cocaine and heroin. And because you're not putting them in the same bracket and giving them the same respect as other people who use drugs. Sorry, I just have to get that.
No. Just to say, this is being recorded, so we will be sending it on to all political parties and candidates as well. So that will all be brought to them too. And Patrick, I'm very conscious of time. I'm sorry for putting anybody off. I'm not going to
Saoirse, could I ask just one quick question to you?
Yeah.
Spent convictions, you mentioned it briefly.
Yeah.
Where are you at?
We are working with Lynn Ruan to try and get her bill picked up by the next.
Minister of Justice committed to pass one within 6 months. Helen McEntee committed to pass it within 6 months when she was forced into the ministry, and she has unfortunately avoided keeping that promise. So passed the Shannon all stages and is currently waiting on government.
Because I was on committee 20 years ago when I was on the National Crime Council, which was before the Justice Committee. They're doing the work we did way back. I was on committee 20 years, so that's how
We will definitely
long.
be pushing it with the next government. We've
Yeah.
done work on it, so rest assured.
Yeah.
I just really want to be fair to Patrick. Given his
Just on that, on the, if someone is committing a crime in 18 and not being sentenced to 23, it highlights that is why community sanctions are so perfect, and they can fit in exactly there.
Yeah.
That's exactly the area that they should be fitting in.
Yeah.
You know, and I think if judges aren't following aren't understanding the disproportionate impact of women in prison, that's where the sentencing guidelines comes in. And I'll leave it there because it's.
Thanks so much. And we will be pushing these forward in the programme for government, so do keep in touch.